Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we've got something a little bit different. I feel like I've said that a few times recently, but this is something different. I wanted to look through the history of Shad Khan's hires in Jacksonville. And technically on the screen, this was not a hire of his, but it's where we start with his tenure as an owner. And I wanted to investigate, how did he choose these candidates? What was their previous experience? Were these up and comers? And I wanted to see if there was any kind of conclusion that I could draw from this. And I'll tell you what, I think there's a lot of things that are very clear when you look at the history. And I'm sure that a lot of other Jaguars fans that have watched this team for a long time are already well aware of this. But I think it's important for us to revisit. How have we got here as an organization? What is the process for how we're choosing our leadership? And is there something that needs to change? Answer is yes. But we're going to get to that towards the very end of this. So, during Shad Khan's time as the owner of the Jaguars, they have hired a lot of what I would like to call formers. So, what that means is it's people who have been in the position previously. It would be, for example, Trent Baalke coming back to Jacksonville not back to Jacksonville, but coming back to the role of being a general manager, right? He was a former general manager. He had experience, and he was hired here to be the general manager. So that would be what a former is. And what I found that was really interesting, looking at this entire tenure of general managers and head coaches, which we've gone through a lot more head coaches than general managers, there are a lot of formers on this list. And I think there's a reason for that. But when Shad Khan took over, he made one change coming in. It wasn't to the general manager. He left Gene Smith in charge for 2012, but he hired a head coach in Mike Mularkey. Now, Mularkey, we can look at his history as a head coach, and he had previous experience. This was someone who had been around the position. He was coaching for Buffalo from 2004 to 2005, as you can see. Worked his way back up through the rankings a little bit, although he did go down here for a little bit, and actually ended up getting a head coach job with Tennessee later on. But it was a former head coach, right? And it was actually one of many head coaches, I say that as in like two, that have come from Buffalo. But Shad Khan started by getting a former, right? And obviously in 2012, things didn't go so well. As you can see, 1 year with the organization, they had their worst season, I believe going 2-14, and both these guys got axed, right? Excuse my phone. Turn that off. Gene Smith, who was here from 2000 to 2012, different roles, but had worked his way up the ranks, was fired in 2012 along with Mike Mularkey. And so what we saw the following year in 2013 was the one time, this is crazy to say, the one time in Shad Khan's entire tenure as an owner where he brought in people that did not have former experience at the position. Unless you're going to count Urban Meyer, I don't really count into that. So Dave Caldwell, we all know Dave Caldwell very well. He was a general manager for about 8 years. And then obviously you got in Gus Bradley. So talking about these guys' history, you can kind of understand why Shad Khan gave them both a chance. It wasn't crazy thinking. It wasn't a stupid decision necessarily at the time, right? Some things just don't work out. But Dave Caldwell was a part of the Atlanta Falcons organization before he got to Jacksonville. He had a lot of previous experience in scouting, and he was someone that made some sense for the job. And there was a time where Dave Caldwell was doing a really good job in Jacksonville. I mean, if you look back at his tenure, obviously the shining mark of it is the 2016 draft. Getting big names in that, right? Jalen Ramsey, like Yannick Ngakoue, Miles Jack, players like that. So there was a reason why Dave Caldwell came here off the promises of what he had shown at positions that were lower and why he could be a good general manager. And you hadn't seen him in the past fail in this position, so he was not one of these formers. Now, with Gus Bradley, kind of the same thing here. Original play caller of the Legion of Boom for the Seattle Seahawks. That was his role. He was with them for 4 years beforehand as the defensive coordinator. And obviously, if you watch football around then, you knew that the Seattle Seahawks were a really damn good team at the time. And so you can question hiring a defensive mind when you brought in Blaine Gabbert shortly after. See how that's gone in, for example, New York with Robert Saleh. But this was a situation that you look at the record for Gus Bradley and you could understand at the time why they made the hire. But Gus Bradley wasn't someone that came in with head coaching experience. He hadn't been with Buffalo from 2004 to 2005 or whatever years or whatever place it was, right? He was a guy who was an up-and-comer. And this was the one time that you saw through the history of Shad Khan's tenure, him actually hire people that had done something at the lower ranks to earn the position and hadn't just had former experience there. Now, obviously, for Dave Caldwell and Gus Bradley, things didn't go well and they were fired, right? They're not with the organization anymore for pretty good reasons. And they had their time. But Gus Bradley is here for 4 years, fired in his 4th year with 2 games left on the schedule. And in comes Doug Marrone. And I had honestly, before this, never looked at the history of Doug Marrone's tenure in the NFL and what he had done in his positions. But if we take a look, so he comes on through obviously a lot of college programs in his life and then gets into the NFL, ends up being the head coach of the Buffalo Bills from 2013 to 2014. It's actually kind of interesting to look at what happened there because apparently he was not even fired from Buffalo. Apparently there was concerns about him getting an extension. He wanted one. The team wasn't going to do it at the time. And it was a very weird situation overall. So maybe technically of the formers, the one that didn't get fired. But Doug Marrone, 2 years of experience as a head coach, right? Comes into Jacksonville after offensive line coach and assistant head coach. When Gus Bradley was fired, there were 2 games left on the schedule. The first being against Tennessee, the second, I do not remember the opponent, but 2 games. The Jaguars had lost something like 9 in a row at the point that Doug Marrone came in. He wins the first game against Tennessee pretty convincingly, ends up losing the second, goes 1-1 as an interim. Nothing impressive, right? At this point, you got to ask, what have you done to earn the head coaching position? Now, I understand that maybe you could argue against that and say, well, technically he wasn't fired from Buffalo. So he obviously earned that job in some way, and you can see some of that coming from college experience because he came from Syracuse to Buffalo. But this is not exactly the kind of top candidate that you imagine. To bring in a guy that's an interim as your head coach. And obviously, he's already there, so I'm saying bring in is even accurate. But Doug Marrone was that in-house hiring, right? It's a similar way as to how Trent Baalke got into his job. So, Doug Marrone, he was the heir apparent. He was an in-house hiring with former head coaching experience. And the same thing, 4 years later, happened to Dave Caldwell. Replaced by the guy right behind him. And we saw Doug Marrone was the assistant head coach. Trent Baalke was essentially the assistant GM. Technically had a different role, but that's what he was functioning as. And they were both replaced by the guy in line behind them, who really didn't do anything with the team to earn the role, but simply was the known commodity. So, Doug Marrone's tenure. Great year in 2017. We all remember it. Wish they won the Super Bowl. They didn't. And then they collapsed, which is what they're good at, apparently. He lasted till 2020. Obviously, didn't pan out as expected. Said he was thinking this was a playoff team in 2020. They went 1-15. And then you go to Trent Baalke. Comes here in 2020 after a bad tenure with San Francisco, a tenure of burning bridges with his head coach, a tenure that saw their roster gutted in a lot of ways, or let's put it like this, a lot of resources wasted. Sound familiar? It's weird. I think it does. But Trent Baalke comes in here in 2020 with a role in the front office. They call him Director of Player Personnel. He was essentially the heir apparent, as you can see, took over as the interim general manager when Dave Caldwell was fired. And I believe Dave Caldwell was fired after a 1-10 or 1-11 start. So he would have taken this job on somewhere around November to December of 2020. There was no search for a GM. We can all remember that. If you were here, he got the job. He was kept in the job. And when Urban Meyer was hired by him and Shad Khan, Urban Meyer let him stay. So he didn't really care a whole ton, quite frankly, about the general manager. He didn't have a guy that he needed, and he said, okay, well, we'll let this guy stay where he is. I don't mind. And Urban Meyer, obviously, had the tenure that he had, right? His only stop in the NFL, never should have even had a stop, but the Jaguars were desperate for some kind of spark. 1-15, you wanted to turn the page, you were getting Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, try to get the home run higher. And obviously that didn't work because, well, Urban Meyer was technically not a known commodity in the NFL. You knew who he was from college. You knew the checkered history, right? Because you have a lot of championships. We had a lot of bad things that happened during his time. I won't talk about them all on here. Y'all know Urban Meyer pretty well. We don't got to revisit him too hard. But it didn't work out, right? And Trent Baalke, going back to him, not a good year in 2021 with Urban Meyer. Didn't do anything in 2020. Wasn't a part of some kind of great staff that was super successful. I mean, the 2021 draft class didn't even look good at the time of their rookie years. Looked bad, right? Andre Cisco couldn't even get on the field. Trevor Lawrence was nowhere near good. Now, excuses for that, right? That's fair. But there's simply nothing that Trent Baalke had done with the Jacksonville Jaguars to earn the job. He was just simply the next guy in line in an organization that decided for some reason that with a terrible tenure under Shad Khan that they needed to promote from within, because apparently within was really good, even though people within were getting fired because it wasn't good. But there was no interview. There was no expectation. It was just, you're the guy here. I know you. I'm comfortable with you. And I'm going to keep you around. And kind of the theme you see with a lot of these former people, right? The people who have been in these roles before. When someone has worked in a position before, you get to see how they perform in that position before you hire them. And you're going to see good things and you're going to see bad things, right? For example, we'll go to our final guy here. Doug Pederson. What was wrong about Doug in Philadelphia, right? He just won a Super Bowl with them. Maybe they were crazy for letting him go. Seemed like it at the time, at least to us. But for Doug Pederson, there were reasons why he did not stick around in Philadelphia. And I would bring this down to three big things. You could list a lot more too. But the first was the failure to adapt to being outcoached. How are you going to change? How are you going to fix the problem? We got to remember, Doug Pederson, well, I don't think 2016 was some incredible year for the Eagles, but they got started pretty well, right? His second year as the head coach, they won the Super Bowl. They had the MVP player if Wentz hadn't got hurt. Maybe he even still won MVP. I'd have to go look back at that. But it was a really strong start to his tenure. And then things started to go downhill. He couldn't adapt. He couldn't change. He wasn't willing to call out some of the problems. Press Taylor being one of those. Sound familiar? The second thing, his franchise quarterback quickly declined after a massive extension. Carson Wentz wasn't the same player when he came back. I think there were a lot of mental things there too, just with Nick Foles obviously leading them to the Super Bowl. Questions there. But Doug Pederson, his job was to keep his quarterback playing at that high level. He didn't do that. And there was even reports that they hadn't talked in weeks at points. Just ridiculous stuff that has no business happening. And the final thing, seemingly lost and dead to the situation that was unraveling. Sound familiar? You know, and I should actually just note that too about the franchise quarterback, right? Sound familiar right now? Everyone's trashing Trevor Lawrence. Everyone's talking about how he is one of the worst starting quarterbacks now in the NFL all of a sudden, which is funny because it feels like the narrative on him just flips a lot. It's either like, look at these great throws that he has, and that should be him all the time, or it's, this guy sucks, right? And I get it. I get it for the fan base, especially because it's a hard time right now. And I think week 1 you could have hope, and week 3 after that you can't, right? Like, this team is dog shit. Let's be real right now. It's what they are at this point. Maybe that changes. I'd be shocked if it did, but that's where we are. But once again, these known commodities, these formers, come with baggage in a lot of cases. Sometimes they don't, right? And I'm not saying that every single situation you can't hire them. I'm not saying you can never get a second chance. But you have to have a reason, a real reason, not just you want to, but a real reason to believe that is not going to happen again. Andy Reid, obviously, is the prime example of a former head coach getting a second chance, of which I think he was even hired the same day he was fired from Philadelphia. So he was not someone that was just clearly awful in Philadelphia. You know, it's not to the extent of a lot of these coaches. But obviously he turned things around. So this is not an end-all be-all necessarily. But if you have a very limited knowledge on who you should hire, or at least very limited football knowledge to know this is a good candidate, this is a bad candidate, you probably shouldn't be hiring those guys because you can't figure out whether or not that baggage is going to come along. And that baggage has carried over for this team multiple times now. Trent Baalke, Urban Meyer, Doug Pederson is the obvious examples. I think that what we can get out of this is that, first of all, just the fact that it has been since 2013 that the Jaguars have refused to allow a new candidate with plenty of opportunities for a candidate. It's not like this team has been some sort of juggernaut at any point of that time. They have failed to allow an up-and-comer to even have a chance. They've chosen the known commodities over and over. It's clear that Shad Khan has not been able to determine what was a problem that was at one stop and maybe won't carry over, and what might be a problem that would translate. And a lot of the time, this is a phrase I feel like I've said a lot this week talking to people, he is looking for the convenient answers, right? That's why he gets convinced of so many things by the people in charge, why they get so long. Because he wants the convenient answer. He wants to look at Doug Pederson as the former Super Bowl champion that is going to win a Super Bowl championship for his team. That's how he wants to see them. But that's really only looking at one side of the coin. And you can't do that. Trying to find what you would prefer and being biased in it is not a good way of hiring people. Because you're going to get burned over and over and over. The honeymoon might feel nice. Might have been great to go 9-8, win that playoff game. That was awesome, right? One of the best memories I have. But eventually, they revert to old habits quite a lot of the time. And that was the case for Doug Pederson. We see the same things unraveling. We know with Trent Baalke, the same things have been unraveling, except we didn't even have like the upside of a good year really from him. He has not had a great tenure in Jacksonville. Now, is the team at least, average as far as talent? I would say so. Even with an 0-3 record, I think that's fair to say. But how many resources has Trent Baalke had to spend? You had tons of first-round picks. You had a ton of cash. This team had all the salary cap in the world. And you gave it to one of the worst people that you could possibly imagine to manage that. And voila, we've maxed out 9-8. And apparently now, with the fourth most spending this offseason, who knows if we get 3 wins? I mean, really, it's a genuine question. This is not some sort of cupcake schedule. Now, you may just try to mark every single easier game as a W. It's not going to go that way. They dropped 2 of those right off the bat this season, and they got blown out, 47-10 Monday Night Football. So it's hard to really believe they're going to be any better than that. But obviously, that's not good enough. And I think, like I kind of mentioned before, when we were talking about just Washington, for example, of a team that has not been managed well recently, that had to reset their process. Now, obviously, the catalyst for that was new ownership. And they at least understood, hey, we don't know a whole lot about how to do this. We're going to get help from people who have been successful. Shad Khan is going to have to get to that point. He's going to have to accept that he needs to be open to more options. He cannot limit himself just to the guys who get swept aside by other organizations for a reason. Because you aren't going to get the Andy Reids here. I think if Andy Reid was available, this is the situation he'd want to go to right now? I don't think so. So he has got to learn to adapt. He has got to learn that this is not as simple as the unknown is a risk and the known is obviously known. It's not that simple, because you risk the baggage that these people carry along. When you hire someone that you don't know, if you have the expertise, whether it's from Shad or advisors or whatever, which I strongly hope that he brings in people to help him with the next decision, that while there may still be risk with the unknown, that you also at least give yourself a chance for long-term success. Because even the best example that we can name of someone who was fired, even though they say he retired or whatever, or mutually parted, the best example being Bill Belichick. I don't even know if Belichick could come in here and have a good tenure, because there are problems they had, right? There's baggage. I'm not saying it would necessarily be a failure. I think it would start off pretty well. But what's going to happen with the problems they had in New England? There's a reason why they were not competitive after that first year without Brady. It's a pretty dang good reason. So, we got to ask ourselves legit questions here. And I hope that Shad Khan, at the end of this year, or whenever the time comes, if it's earlier, and it appears it's going to be earlier as of now, that he is able to look in the mirror and make the right decision and bring in the right people to help him make that decision. And if they get it wrong again, it's going to be disaster for Trevor Lawrence, if it isn't already. Because this situation that we are in right now, I don't know if people understand just how bad it can get. If Trevor Lawrence does not work out as the franchise quarterback, and while you may keep telling yourself that there's no way that he was the first overall pick, he was generational. Remember 2022. Look, I want to believe in him too. I'm not saying I don't, but there is a very real, way more likely chance now than before that he is not going to work out for this team. And if that happens, you are stuck with him in 2024, 2025, 2026, 2027, and 2028. Unless you want the big cap hit. So, not a good situation. It is a really bad situation to be in, and it's because of these convenient answers that they've wanted to find. They want to act like a championship organization without taking the steps to be there. It's frustrating. But we got to hope that it isn't already too late, because we've got 4 years of his career completely wasted, and not only wasted, but having probably done more damage than good. Because let's bring in the guy who broke Carson Wentz to fix Trevor Lawrence. Good idea. So that's all I've got for this video. Before we do sign out, though, I want to shout out our channel members. This is something new we'll be doing. We've had this around for a little bit with the memberships, but we had 3 people sign up this week and really appreciate it. And so we'll have this graphic at the end of videos. You guys, if you want to, you're not expected to. I love having everyone here regardless of whether or not you're doing any memberships, right? But if you want to, you're more than welcome to sign up. I would love to be able to do a lot of these things, and it's great that we're finally able to now. But we've got 3 tiers. Duval Faithful is your basic one. You get loyalty badges. You'll get custom emojis, priority replies. So if I don't get to everyone, you will be the top priority, and Discord access as we build that out. On the Prowl, we'll have early access to videos, member shoutouts, and the and the perks of the previous tier, Duval Faithful. In our top tier, Till We Die, we'll also have monthly roundtable chats, date to be determined right now. We'll have discounted merchandise on our store, and we'll have all the perks of On the Prowl in Duval Faithful. So, with that said, want to shout out Premier Nasir 904 and Mr. Dolphin for signing up, and everyone else that has, and everyone else that's going to. Really appreciate you guys' support. It's been a great week, even with the terrible Buffalo game, right? But at least we're getting our answers. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one. Finally, go Jags.